Chapter 10, Christian Theology and Other Religions, of David Clarke's book, To Know and Love God. This is a challenging chapter in some ways, because I think it deals with uses language that we may not be as familiar with. But hopefully what I can do here in this video is kind of give you another way of getting at some of the same ideas that he's talking about here. So I hope that when you read the chapter, you think to yourself, oh, this is what he's talking about. If I try to explain the same idea with a little bit different language, you understand, then you read what he's talking about here and the language that he uses. You kind of put the two together. Hopefully you can get the general sense of what's going on. This is a confusing chapter in some ways, as I said, with the language, but it's an important one, I believe, especially in today's world, where he talks about pluralism here, and that's sort of what the world in which we live, where there are so many religions out there. We interact with people on a daily basis often who have those religions, who hold to those religions. And the question that we're wrestling with in this chapter is, how do we interact with those people? What is our posture as Christians towards those who come from other religions? And I think he has some good categories here. It's worth wrestling through the language to understand what he's trying to say, so that you can have some categories to think about it. I think that in this chapter 2, he critiques John Hick and Gordon Kaufman. I think those are brilliant critiques. I'll try to talk about those critiques in a little bit different language, but I think it's important for you to understand those things. Okay, so we start off here talking about the challenge of pluralism. And really all that is just to say that we live in this pluralistic society. He talks about two senses in which you could talk about pluralism. I think it's good in your summaries to note both of those ways. It's helpful to see the kind of pluralism we live in today. So note those. Note here too that he has a very specific point in this chapter. I think I've said this before. When you see purpose statements in chapters, you always want to be clued into those. When the author says, this is what I'm doing in this chapter, you want to note that. And then if you can't see how he or she actually accomplishes that task, you probably haven't understood the chapter, or the chapter is poorly written. I think in this case the chapter is well written. The purpose statement is towards the bottom of the first page of the chapter 319. He says, my point in this chapter is to ask, is evangelical theology a legitimate enterprise and a rational discipline in view of the many religions? So how can we be doing theology, and how is that a legitimate task to do theology when there are so many different religions out there? Does this mean anything? Does our task at theology have meaning and purpose in light of pluralism? The answer is a resounding yes, and it's all the more important because of the so many different religions. We must clarify what Christians believe. We must do that for our own faith, for evangelism, that we can share the gospel. Okay, so a couple clarifications here. He talks here about the truth in other religions. On page 324, he's talking about how we can understand, is there truth in other religions? And he makes a good distinction here that I just want you to pay attention to. He says that even if we say Christianity is true, and that which opposes Christianity is false, okay? Even if we affirm, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me, John 14:6. We affirm that is true, and that means that those who think that there is another way to the Father, well, what they're saying is false. That's what it means to be a Christian. We're committed to that exclusivism, as the author talks about it. Nevertheless, that is not to say that there is no truth in other religions in every sense. That is not to say, in other words, that everything that another religion says is false. Okay, so we pick another religion and say it is a false religion, that it does not get us to to the knowledge of God. But if that other religion says that murder is wrong, which most of them do, we don't think that that statement that they say murder is wrong is false, and that murder is actually not wrong. No. An unbelieving religion can say things that are true in some sense, and we can affirm the truth in those other religions. He gives some examples here. Judaism holds to monotheism. Islam contradicts polytheism. We can say, okay, there's a sense in which they are true in that assertion. There is one God. Islam says that, Judaism says that. We can say, okay, that is a true statement in some sense. Now you clarify exactly what they mean by that one God. You realize that that prohibits the notion of the Trinity, and you realize, okay, I can't agree to that entirely. Nevertheless, there is a sense in which it's true. Here's where this is important. I was having lunch one day, actually, with Dr. Haig and my friend Jonathan Lehman. We were sitting down to a restaurant. It was in Washington, D.C. We got into a discussion with the waiter about Christianity. And I forget exactly how the conversation unfolded, but the waiter basically said that he thought all religions were true, and you didn't have to be sectarian in your understanding of Christianity, just following the Christian religion. Yes, it was great. The waiter was saying that we were Christians, but really all religions were true, and the waiter just wanted to kind of pick and choose from different parts of different ones. And I thought it was so wise in the conversation. Jonathan Lehman, who we were having lunch with, he didn't come right out and contradict him or challenge him in that idea that all religions were true. He said instead, the first thing he said was, well, I would agree that all religions have some truth in them, because if they were entirely false, why would anybody believe them? I mean, imagine a religion that only holds to false statements. I am not a human. We do not exist. This world is not round. I don't know. Every single proposition that you could think of is true. This religion held to that proposition, but making it false. Imagine someone, every single thing that's obviously true, someone held to the exact opposite of that. Well, it would just seem so ludicrous. Who in the world would actually believe that? Which is why all false religions have a grain of truth in them, and then they spin that truth in ways that show it to be false. I thought it's a very helpful distinction here that the author is making, and that Jonathan Lehman made in that conversation. As I said, he didn't just contradict the waiter and say, well, actually, I believe that Christianity is the only truth. He began instead by saying, yes, all religions might have some truth in them. Again, most religions affirm that murder is wrong. Like I said, Judaism affirms that there is one God, and so on and so on. But then he was able to take the conversation to the point where we say, but really the question is, are there multiple ways to God? The question is not, do other religions have some truth in them? The question is, will another approach to God work? Is there another way to have forgiveness of sins outside of the death of the Lord Jesus Christ and his shedding of blood for us and our faith in him? That's the question. It's not whether or not there is truth in all religions. It is there another way to God? A helpful clarification. I just want to share how I saw that practically played out for good in a conversation. Okay, moving on here. We get into a discussion on page 326 on alethic realism, and basically the issue here is the propositions are the things we say in theology, right? We're doing a theology class, and this is theology, systematic theology 1, and you go all the way up to systematic theology 4, so we have a lot of theology here. And in theology, we are making statements about God and his world and how he relates to the world and how we are to know him. And this could seem so basic. I think we might miss the point of what's actually going on here because it's so obvious to us who are Christians. But the question is, are those statements that we make about God, are they referring to something more than just the statements themselves? Is there a truth content outside of the statements that they're actually referring to? When I say, for instance, I'm talking to my phone right now, which is a bit weird, but that's what I'm doing, making this video for you. I think that there is something, I'm referring to my phone when I use that word phone, right? I'm referring to something that's actually out there, that's a real object to be known. When we talk about God, God is love, God is holy, God is just, God saves through His Son. When I'm referring to God, am I referring to something that is real out there? Well, some would say, no, we're not. We're simply creating linguistic constructions that are useful for our lives and serve the purpose of our community. Some would say that we can approach religion from the perspective that it's not ultimately true. It's not referring to something that is ultimate out there. No, there is nothing ultimate out there. Nevertheless, that sense of religion is still valuable because it gives us something to talk about as a community. It gives us a sense of peace. We need it to cope with death. We need it experientially, even though it is not objectively true. And the whole idea of religious studies could be looked at from that perspective of, what does it mean to talk about the idea of God, even if we're pretty sure He doesn't actually exist, or whether or not He exists isn't important to the question at hand. See the point here? The word aletheia comes from the Greek word aletheia for truth. And the question is what we're referring to actually true? He kind of splits hairs here for a little bit in terms of getting into some fine distinctions. I think it's fine if you sort of breeze over some of those. But let me just take you back to that main idea of what's going on here. It might seem kind of crazy, people talking about religion and not actually believing that the words they use refer to something outside of the words themselves. But nevertheless, a lot of people think that way. And he's just helping you understand these categories. If you talk to somebody who is a religion major at a university or something, don't be surprised if that person turns out to actually be an atheist formally, not really believing that God does exist. Nevertheless, they think that using the words about God are important for community, for life, and wants to study the words that we use about God and how we use them anyway. Okay, so moving on then to the pluralist, just pluralism and realism in going on there. He talks about two different approaches to the study of religion. Hicks and Gordon Kaufman. And they're different in the way they approach religion. Both of them are coming from a distinctly non-Christian perspective. Neither one gets us any further than the other. But they do come at it very differently. And I think the way he critiques them differently is important to see. So John Hick, he is a realist. He believes that there is ultimate reality out there. Right? He believes that God is real and the divine is this transcendent reality. And then he believes that, but yet he's not an exclusivist. He's not a Christian. He outright denies John 14, Jesus saying, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father by me." He buys into the Baha'i approach that there is one God and many paths to this one God. But he still insists that there is that one God out there, and that one God must, and indeed does, inform our approach to Him. Now, he will say, though, that this one God is so high above us, so utterly transcendent, that we can't really know anything true about him. Hence, all the approaches to him do look very different, right? He's under no illusion, John Hick's under no illusion, because he's studied religions, that the Buddhist approach to God and the Christian approach to God look very different. But he chalks that up to the idea that God is so high and mysteriously, mysterious and above us, that we can't actually know true things about him. So obviously our approach to him is going to be different, because no one knows the one true thing about him. That would be impossible for us humans to know. He is high and lifted up and different than us, so different that he can never actually give us true knowledge about him. Therefore, all ways to him are going to be different. Now, the author here, I think, very skillfully argues against that approach, and you can note here how he does that. But in brief, he's trying to say that if God is that far transcendent above us, how would we ever know that? How do you know that there is this one God who is above us and transcendent, and therefore causes our differing approaches to him? If we don't know him, then how is it that he is going to create those many different paths to him? And then the other approach by Gordon Kaufman, and it's interesting too that both Kaufman and Hick started out as Christians in their journey, and then realized they weren't true Christians because they would have been kept in God's grace, but they both were professing Christians at a time, and yet through religious study ended up denying Orthodox Christianity and articulating something very different. But Gordon Kaufman takes an opposite approach, as I said before, with a non-alethic realism. So he is saying that the ultimate reality doesn't actually exist. There is no God in a formal sense. Our word about God does not refer to something outside of the word about God. Nevertheless, he is studying religion from the perspective of our talk about God and the category that God fills for us in our human experience. And he brings this idea of God very close to us, because God isn't far and above out there. Rather, it is our experience of our category for God, very close to us. And again, once again, the author critiques that as basically being nonsensical. Let me give you another kind of way to approach this. As I said before, I want to give you sort of some different language to get at this. I think these critiques are good and important to see, but as I said before, they're a little bit difficult, I think, for a large part because the language is not very familiar to us. But language that I think is actually very biblical is the idea of transcendence and immanence. So the Bible talks about God as being both transcendent and immanent. That is, God is so high above us. My ways are not your ways, God says, right? Nor my thoughts your thoughts. God is not like anything in our world. As one of the church fathers said, God is light, but no light. God is light, but like no light that we have ever seen. Which is just to say that God doesn't fit into our human categories. We will not have mastery over him. Think of Moses at the burning bush. God says, I am who I am. And that's a passage we could unpack for quite a while, just to learn about the transcendence of God, that he is so far above us. Nevertheless, God is also immanent. He is right down here with us. He is both transcendent, high above us, and immanent, right here with us. He comes down and condescends so that he can speak to us in ways that we can understand. God can reveal himself to us. As Francis Schaeffer once said, God, he is there and he has spoken. Or he is not silent. He is there and he is not silent. The title of one of Schaeffer's famous books. So God is both transcendent and immanent. Now, what do non-Christian religions do? Well, as I said before, there is elements of truth in those non-Christian religions, but it's truth that a partial truth, when it masquerades as a whole truth, becomes a total lie. And non-Christian religions will say that God is either only transcendent or only immanent. And you could look at John Hick and what he is saying as God is only transcendent. God is only so high above us, we're never going to actually know him. Okay, but if we only say that God is so high above us, then it turns out that what's the use of talking about him? Because we don't actually know him. There's no way to know that our words about him actually correspond to anything. And that's kind of the critique that Gordon Clark uses here. So a non-Christian religion will start with God's transcendence and deny God's immanence. Hick here says that God is high above us, but yet he is not able to reveal himself to us in our unique situation, in our circumstance, in our human capacity for knowledge. And again, when you take one but not the other, it ultimately falls apart. Because if God is just transcendent, then how would I know him, right? From a completely non-Christian perspective, you might say, okay, let's say there is this God way above us. How would you know that? How would he reveal himself to us? You've just created a category for God, created a definition for God in which you've made it impossible for him to reveal himself to us. And what's the difference between a transcendent God who can't reveal himself to us and no God at all? At the end of the day, I think that is a pretty tough question for those who would say that God is just transcendent to answer. But at the other end of the spectrum is what Kaufman is advocating here, which is that God would be, you could say, entirely immanent, in that Kaufman would say that religion is real, but it's altogether in our experience. So yes, God is real, but only in terms of the language we use to speak about him, in the immediate personal feelings I have towards him. I need God so that I can personally cope with death, that I can have this feeling and religious life. My talk about God is all related to the immanent, to my personal experience, not at all to the transcendence. So you see, then just to take us back here to the big picture, the true God, the God of the Bible, the God we believe in, is both transcendent and immanent. That means he is high above us, exalted above us, and yet he reveals himself. He reaches down into our world and he is close. We can know him. That's the God of the Bible, the God who reveals himself in the Lord Jesus Christ. He walks among us, and then he sends his Spirit to dwell in us. The God who is high above us is dwelling in and among us. That's the beauty of Christianity, that God is transcendent and immanent. Praise God for that. What non-Christian religions do is they deny one of them. They take either God's transcendence or God's immanence, claim that that is the only mode of his existence, and then they end up with a God who is very, very different than the God of the Bible. Hick advocates the transcendence only. Kaufman advocates the immanence only. And those are two very different approaches to the study of religion. Well, that's just important to, I think, understand that his critique, understand transcendence and immanence. And then moving on then to how evangelicals interface with other religions. How do we talk with them? And, the last part here of this book, I think, is very, very helpful and very clear. So you might get, to about the middle of it and say, all these categories, all this language here, I'm not sure what's going on. That's okay. I'm trying to clarify the big picture here for you, but keep going, because you get to the end and the section on the implications for tolerance and how Christianity interfaces with pluralism, I think, are very good and very practical. So especially pay attention to these. And once again, let me just try to give you some other language to get at these same things. One way, and this is a phrase that he didn't use, but I really like for how Christianity interfaces with other religions. I really like the idea of what's called subversive fulfillment. Subversive fulfillment. That phrase was coined by, I think, a guy named Bavinck 100 years or so ago. He was a Dutch missiologist. And then more recently, a book was written that explained this view more clearly. The book by Daniel Strange. The book is called Their Rock is Not Our Rock. Great book on the theology of other religions. Their rock is not our rock. That's a phrase from the book of Deuteronomy talking about the other nations out there. And the whole idea of subversive fulfillment is basically this. We said before that other religions would contain some sense of truth, right? They're not altogether false. An altogether false religion would be so absurd, nobody would ever follow it. But what is the relationship then between the Christian faith and the truth, put in quotation marks, the truth in the other religions? How does Christianity fit there? Well, what subversive fulfillment says is that Christianity is the fulfillment of the truth in those other religions, right? Christianity comes in and fulfills the categories that they are pointing toward, but in such a way that at the same time subverts those categories as well. It turns those categories on their head. So, for example, the moral. Think of religions that would just talk about morality, and you could look at the Eastern religions that are essentially moral religions. Confucianism, just here's the way you ought to live. The religions that are just so focused on your morals, or think of kind of the religion of secularism in many parts of the United States today that is about, you have this code that you must live by that has a lot to do with the environment and how we treat people. And again, in many ways, a lot of the things that it advocates aren't actually wrong. So we're talking then about a religion that's going to be very, very moralistic in its approach. It's not going to deal much with transcendent realities, but say, here's the code that you must live by. How does Christianity interface with those kinds of moralistic religions, for example? And I think we would say that, well, Christianity comes in and says, oh, there is a code that you must live by because God is holy. But see, it's not for the reason that you think we ought to live by this code. The reason why we must live in such a way that is good and right is actually for very different reasons than you're saying we should live by these standards. There might be some similarity in terms of how those false religions and Christianity is saying we ought to live. Again, we'll agree that murder is wrong. We'll agree that lying is wrong. We'll agree superficially on certain tenets of how we ought to live. But the reason why we ought to live that way for Christians is much, much, much different than for the other religions. I think of, thinking about the kind of moralism, the secular moralism in America, one book on ethics by Peter Singer, where he's advocating what is the right thing to do and how we ought to live, related to the environment, related to refugees, related to life. And some of his ethics, I think, is utterly repulsive. Other parts of his ethics are actually pretty good, right? But then when he gets to the very last chapter in his book, why we should live morally, he basically says, yeah, I don't have a good answer there. So he's all about morals and how we ought to live, but then if you ask why we should live morally, he has no answer. Christianity has the best answer, right? We should be holy because God is holy. So how does Christianity relate to, for instance, the moralistic religions? Well, it says here is the ultimate standard of truth and holiness, God himself. and we should be holy because God is holy, because he's made us in his image. And those reasons why we should be holy subvert and overturn the other religions. So I think subversive fulfillment there is a very helpful category to think through. And I can't say enough about Daniel Strange's approach. I think it works well. And finally, let me just say one more thing about that I think this book gets right. To know and love God, that is. In this chapter, he talks about how really the arrogance and condescension of those in religious studies that would claim that religion is a good thing and would claim to be giving credence to believers and adherents, those who follow certain religions, and yet in their religious studies and their academic understanding of it, totally change the meaning of that religion, such as to say that it is the same as other religions. So let me give you an example here. So I had a friend when I was a pastor down in by DC, and he was a very religious man. He had studied religion in college and actually wrote a lot of the Wikipedia articles for various religious studies things. And he thought it was great that I was a religious person. And we would talk about religion, but every time we did, he would sort of take what I believe and translate it through his lens, that what I believed was actually no different than what his Muslim friend believed and his Buddhist friend believed. See, he basically looked at me as a religious person and said that my belief was the same as other people's belief, and thus totally misunderstood what I was actually saying. He was always so happy to talk to me because I was a religious guy, but completely did not understand what I was actually all about. I did not understand my Christianity in the same way he thought of my Christianity. So there was always a disconnect, even though he didn't acknowledge it. And I remember it being always so frustrating to actually have a conversation with him. Compared to another person I knew, a neighbor who was staunchly secular and hated it that we were Christians. She didn't really like me a lot, but I felt understood by her. I felt like, at least she recognizes what I actually do believe. I'm sure she misunderstood it in many different ways as well. But the point here, and this book brings this out really well, is that there's something kind of arrogant and condescending when in the area of religious studies, when somebody would study religion, but basically make all the religions out to be saying the same thing. They're not actually understanding what any one person is actually saying. It's actually kind of offensive, even though they're trying to say, all religions are good, they lead to the same place. They're trying to be inclusive. It's actually kind of offensive because what they're saying is what you actually believe doesn't matter, and I have the right to redefine what you actually believe in order to make it more palatable. Well, one more thing, and just in terms of the same kind of another illustration of that same reality. Where I lived, there was a ecumenical group that met regularly, pastors from different religious organizations. Some of them claimed to be churches, some of them did not claim to be churches, synagogue, Baha'i, Islam. And in this gathering that all the clergy, when they would get together, there was this sort of assumption that in order to have a seat at the table, in order to meet and get together, you basically had to say that everybody was right. And unless you were willing to give that up and say, okay, everybody's essentially right, we're just, as Gordon Kaufman talks about, we're just talking about this, Gordon Clark or John Hick, either one, we're talking about the same ultimate reality, but we're just using different language, or either way to get it to something that's extremely inclusive. In order to be a full member of this group, the unwritten rules were you had to basically think everybody else was the same. I never actually went to these meetings, even though I interacted with the clergy that was part of it. But I ended up instead of going to their meetings regularly, I ended up getting together with a Catholic priest, a pastor, and he was actually somewhat conservative. He thought that I, in my Protestantism, was wrong. He thought that I was wrong, and my soul was, if not in danger of hell, at least not in the best place it could be, because I had separated from the Catholic Church. So he believed what I believed was wrong. I believed what he believed was wrong, that he was holding to a false gospel, as he held to the tenets of the Catholic Church, that, particularly the aspects of their theology that says that anyone who holds to justification by faith alone is damned. He believed that, and therefore I believed he was wrong. He believed that I was wrong, and we would get together, every month or so, and we would have these fantastic discussions, because we both believed that truth was real. We both believed each other didn't have it. We both believed that it mattered, and we were willing to dialogue, use words to try to persuade the other. It was a great time, good discussion. We could become intense at times because we were passionate about what we believed, but we cared about each other. We knew that these things mattered, and therefore we were willing to talk about them. So we ended up calling ourselves the anti-ecumenical group of the city, just kind of as a joke, to say that we both believed in real truth, in absolute truth, but we just thought each other didn't have it. And I think that's a much healthier way that Christians can interact. I think Christians can bring something to the table then in their communities, because we can say, hey, we do think the truth matters. We are willing to dialogue about this. But we can do it in such a way that respects the other person. We don't have to belittle the person and make fun of the person and hurt the person because we disagree with them. We can respect them as being made in the image of God, and we believe that these things matter. We believe that there is ultimate truth. So we're willing to enter into this dialogue, and we have reason to dialogue because we believe that what we're talking about is referring to these realities that are out there, that are real. So I think Christianity then has a lot to offer, as we talk about religion in the community. No, we're not going to say that we're not going to acknowledge that in order to get a seat at the table, we give up the idea that there is one truth and the Bible explains it. But on the other hand, when we do get together, we want to engage positively and constructively and respectfully with the others. Well, I hope this chapter helps you think through how Christianity interfaces with other religions. This is something that I think is eminently practical. If you haven't had these discussions yet, I'm sure you will. And I hope this prepares you for your ministry.